So today we're going to cover Chapter 25, which is Fiscal Policy. Fiscal policy is the government getting involved and intervening in trying to fix the market, fix issues in the market, by essentially forcing close expansionary or recessionary gaps. So by definition, fiscal policy is the use of government revenue and expenditure. So intake of money, spending, they're part, remember, of the aggregate expenditure equation. They're that government spending piece. So it's the use of government revenue and expenditure to influence the economy and how it affects your GDP, employment, price level, so remember that's inflation, and economic growth, which is essentially productivity. There are several different ways that the government can implement fiscal policy, or there's a few different ways that fiscal policy shows up in government decision making. First one is going to be taxation. How they tax the people and how they tax corporations. Do they increase taxes? Do they decrease taxes? That obviously is going to change the way the companies spend and individuals spend depending on the amount of money that they have. Government purchases, increasing or decreasing the amount of government purchase. This can be in a lot of different forms for a lot of different things. Transfer payments. Transfer payments is basically collecting money in the form of taxes and then redistributing it to people in the economy in the form of Social Security payments, unemployment payments, welfare payments, disability payments. So essentially giving money to people that have lost their revenue for whatever reason. Borrowing. We know that the U.S. government does a lot of borrowing in order to finance transfer payments, government purchases, etc. And so it's just another tool that the government has if they want to increase their own purchasing, or if they can't quite cover the transfer payments that they're liable for, they can borrow money in order to do that. There are two basic categories of fiscal policy tools. The first one we're going to talk about is automatic stabilizers. It's not nearly as important as the next one we're going to talk about, but we need to understand that there's fiscal policy at work all the time in our economy. So automatic stabilizers, again, government revenue and spending programs, that's what fiscal policy is, but programs that adjust with fluctuation in the economy to stabilize disposable income. So basically there are a couple of mechanisms built into our economy, so they're there all the time, helping stabilize people's disposable incomes in times of recession or in times of expansion. So the first one we're going to talk about is the federal income tax. Remember that we have a progressive taxation system, which means that the more money you make, the higher percentage of your income you pay in taxes, and vice versa. The lower your income, the lower the percentage that you pay in taxes. So what that means is that when times are really good and people are making a lot of income, we're taking a lot of that, or a higher percentage of that, away from them so they don't get too crazy on the spending. And vice versa, when times are bad, we take lower amounts of taxes from people because people are making lower incomes, and so we can keep spending as high as possible. Transfer payments, again, built into our economy all the time. We are always making transfer payments to people. But in times of recession, what we find is we have higher unemployment rates, we have higher welfare rates, and so we are distributing more transfer payments than ever, and that's to keep spending up. That's to keep those incomes stabilized so people keep spending in the economy. We know that spending is the most important thing when it comes to the health of an economy. So these are just two ways to keep spending in check so that we're not spending too much or we're not spending too little in the economy. And so just two basic tools that are built in that we always have in our economic system. The second type of discretionary fiscal policy is the one that we're going to talk most about in this chapter, and that's discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is really that one-time big decision by the current administration to do something to really bring the economy usually out of a recession, but it can also try and pull the economy back down if we're expanding too fast as well. But these are government decisions to manipulate purchases, transfer payments, or taxes to promote economic goals. So anytime the government announces some sort of a stimulus package to stimulate the economy, or anytime that the government announces some sort of a tax reduction or tax rebate or tax cut, that's a stimulus package. That's something that may live the life of the administration, so 4 years, 8 years, whatever, but not necessarily. It could be just a tax cut for this year. It could be just a stimulus package to deal with some crisis or something that's going on right now in the economy. So let's talk about how the government uses those tools to close recessionary and expansionary gaps, which we talked about in the last chapter. So first thing the government can do, the thing that the government has control over in terms of expenditure, aggregate expenditure, their component of aggregate expenditure, is government purchases. They can decrease their purchases, they can increase their purchases, depending on how they want to manipulate the economy, how they need to manipulate the economy at that time. So if the government believes unemployment's too high, so over 4 or 5%, the government can implement some policies in order to try and get employment up. How do we get employment up? Well, we have to give people jobs. Well, what stimulates job growth? Well, production, demand for goods and services in the economy. And so that's what the government would target in a case like this, or could target in a case like this. So if government believes unemployment is too high, they can increase government purchases. Just the simple act of the government spending more money means they're going to put more people back to work, because that money that they're spending is spent on goods and services that somebody has to make. That's an increase in production. And so somebody has to go back to work and start to make those things, those goods and services. So if the government increases their purchases, it will shift aggregate expenditure. It will increase aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G plus net exports. It's going to increase that. And it's going to shift the aggregate expenditure line up. We'll look at a graph here in a minute and I'll show you that. Production, making those goods and services for the government, is going to increase the income of the people who are making those goods. And then remember, we talked about those rounds of spending that happen. That simple spending multiplier that we see when new spending is injected into the economy. That's going to mean that those people put back to work producing those goods and services for the government are going to receive an income. And then what do they do with that income? They spend it. And when they spend it, it becomes income for somebody else who spends it. And then it becomes income for somebody else who spends it. And so we have that multiplication effect in the economy. So just a small injection of government purchases can net a much larger amount of GDP demanded in the economy. So we have those rounds of spending that happens, and because we put all those people back to work and we have all that increased demand and increased spending, unemployment is going to decrease as a result. So here's a graph, should look familiar. We talked about it a chapter or two ago. This is that graph in which we use our 45-degree tool. What is the 45-degree tool? Well, remember, it splits the graph in half. We have a 90-degree angle here. It essentially splits this into two 45-degree angles and creates a series of points. That's all a line is a series of points in which GDP is equal to aggregate expenditure, and we know those two things are equal, so it's just a tool, a point of reference for us to use. So then when we graph the aggregate expenditure line on there, and we find the place in which they intersect, we know what the GDP is going to be for that year. So what we've seen happen here is we've seen a shift in aggregate expenditure. Aggregate expenditure has increased, in this case, by $0.1 trillion in increased government purchases. That was the scenario we just talked about on the previous slide, increase in government purchases to perhaps decrease our unemployment rate. And so we've seen a shift in aggregate expenditure in the upward direction. Well, before that increase in government spending, we had GDP of $14 trillion, according to this graph. Because that's the point of intersection here between your AE line and your 45-degree tool. But then once we've seen that shift happen, you can see our GDP goes from 14 trillion to 14.5 trillion. So a $0.1 trillion increase in government spending actually turned into a $0.5 trillion increase in real GDP demanded and produced during that year. So that's that multiplication effect happening. We'll look at the numbers here in a minute and we'll go through the calculation. So in this particular economy, let me kind of set you up for this equation. In this particular economy, our marginal propensity to consume is a 0.8, which means that if you get new money, if we get new money as an economy, we tend to spend about 80% of it, which means we do what with the other 20%? We save it, right? And so in this case, we have an MPC of 0.8, which means we have an MPS of 0.2. So how do we calculate our simple spending multiplier to figure out how that change in government spending would actually impact the economy? Well, the equation is 1 divided by MPS. 1 divided by 0.2, our marginal propensity to save, is going to be 5, so our multiplier is 5. So in this case, we've calculated our multiplier of 5. Once you get a multiplier, just remember you have to multiply it. Multiply it by what? By the change in spending. So in this case, we have a multiplier of 5. We multiply it times our $0.1 trillion increase in government spending, and we end up with a 0.5 or $0.5 trillion increase in GDP demanded. If we go back to the previous slide, that's exactly what we found here. We found that that $0.1 trillion increase in government spending turned into a $0.5 trillion increase in GDP. All right, let's talk about taxes. Taxes being the second primary discretionary fiscal policy tool that the government has if they want to do something big and dramatic. Remember, we have a taxation system. Personal income tax, which is an automatic stabilizer in our economy. But these one-time tax cuts and tax rebates can also be used as discretionary fiscal policy, or those one-time sort of boosts for the economy, or to pull the economy back from overheating. So in this case, we'll talk about a change in taxes and how that can achieve essentially the same goal. So in this case, if the government wants to decrease unemployment, which means they want to stimulate demand. Stimulating demand means we need more goods and services, which means we put people back to work. The government can also reduce net taxes. Reduce net taxes. So they can cut your taxes, which does what to spending? It increases your spending. So instead of the government increasing their spending, they can cut your taxes to increase your spending. Both achieve the same objective, but as you're going to see, the multiplier is going to be a little different depending on the decision that government makes. So the government would propose a tax cut. The administration would do that. We know that's happening right now. This would increase disposable income for households. We know you might save some, so we do take that into account. You'll see that in the multiplier. Households will increase their spending because when we give you money, we know what you do with it. You spend it. The series of spending rounds begins. Income becomes spending, becomes income, becomes spending, becomes income, becomes spending. And we're going to end up with an increase in GDP, an increase in demand. So the same thing is going to happen, not quite in the same quantity. It's not going to have quite the same impact, but the same thing is going to happen. We're going to increase GDP. So on this graph, we are seeing the effect of a $0.1 trillion decrease in net taxes on aggregate expenditure and real GDP demanded. In this particular economy, remember that when we give you new money, when we give you additional funds, you save 20% and you spend 80%. That's the primary difference between change in government spending and cutting your taxes to change your spending, is it's not quite as impactful, because we think you're going to save some of it. And from the data that we have, we think you're going to save 20% of it. And so what we see here is not a shift of the full $0.1 trillion, but only 80% of that, because you're only going to spend 80% of whatever that additional income that you got to keep because of that tax cut is. So you can see in this case, we have a 0.08 increase in consumption, right? Now it falls under consumption spending, or the consumption component of aggregate expenditure. And we've ended up with a $0.4 trillion increase in GDP demanded. So in this case, it's the same amount of tax cut as government spending, except for you don't turn around then and spend all that money that the government gave you. So that accounts for the difference. So let's do that calculation. There is a new calculation here for the simple tax multiplier. Simple tax multiplier is negative MPC divided by MPS. So in this case, we have the same economy with an MPC of 8, MPC of 2. So we have a negative 0.8 divided by 0.2 gives us a negative 4. In this case, you can have a negative multiplier. With the simple tax multiplier, you want to keep that negative. Where with the simple spending multiplier, remember we take the absolute value in the end anyway, so you can just drop the negatives from the beginning. So in this case, we have a negative multiplier times the change in net taxes. Here you also want to keep the sign. You have a negative amount of tax, so you're getting taxed less, so taxes are going down. So that's a negative. So a negative times a negative in this case, taxes are going down. It's going to give you a positive. So in this case, we have a $0.4 trillion increase in GDP. You saw that on the previous slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how the government would use fiscal policy to close recessionary and expansionary gaps. So let's start first with a recessionary gap. Recessionary gap when we are producing below the economy's potential output, that natural, sustainable level of output that each economy has. So in this case, let's talk about how discretionary fiscal policy would close that recessionary gap. We know that the economy naturally tries to close those gaps, and we know that that happens from the last chapter when we talked about the supply curve and how the supply curve shifts and ends up closing that gap when the economy tries to self-correct. Now we're talking about the government trying to force a correction to happen. So in this case, we're talking about a recessionary gap. If the economy is producing less than its potential output, that's a recessionary gap. The government can increase their purchases, so the G in the aggregate expenditure equation, or they can cut your taxes to increase your purchases or increase C, the consumption component of aggregate expenditure. So they can do one or the other, or a combination of the two as the case may be, in order to return the economy to its potential output. We call this kind of fiscal policy expansionary fiscal policy because it's trying to expand the economy to get us out of a recession, to close that recessionary gap. So this graph should look familiar to you because we saw this graph in the last chapter. In this case, we have aggregate supply and aggregate demand and an equilibrium here at E of $13.5 trillion worth of GDP, where our potential output, long-run aggregate supply, is at 14 trillion. So we're producing below potential output, creating that recessionary gap of $500 billion. We know from the last chapter that the economy is constantly trying to self-correct. And in this case, what would happen is resources would get cheap, which would end up shifting the supply curve to the right and close that gap. Well, this is a very different scenario that brings us back to potential output in the same way, but with a little bit of a different impact. So in this case, while the economy is self-correcting all the time, the government can step in if it feels like the government, needs to get involved to close that gap faster than the economy would naturally close that gap and heal itself. So in this case, the government would want to either increase their purchases or decrease your taxes to increase your purchases. which would increase aggregate demand. There's more money to spend, there's more money in the economy. That's going to be spent on more things, more goods and services, and those rounds of spending are also going to happen. So in this case, we're going to see an increase in demand, which is going to shift the demand curve to the right, which is going to then close that gap. So let's watch that demand curve shift. We now end up with an equilibrium back here at potential output. The government, using fiscal policy, has been able to heal the economy and close that recessionary gap quicker probably than the economy could have done it on its own. There are economists that would argue that point, but according to your author and for the sake of this class, this is a commonly accepted economic principle. So we have ended up in this case with a higher price level or inflation as a result of that increased demand. That's okay. That just is going to be one of the after effects of that shift in the aggregate demand curve. So we have a little bit of inflation here. That inflation is demand pull inflation because it is the demand curve that ended up pulling the price levels up. So let's look at the opposite scenario, which is an expansionary gap. So if we have an expansionary gap, what that means is we're producing beyond or above our potential output, that nice sustainable level of output for our economy. And in that case, the economy is overheating a little bit. We're pushing it beyond its sustainable rates. And so what we need to do is we need to calm it back down. We need to not let it overheat by getting that expansionary gap in check. So in this case, expansionary gap, what can the government do in order to get us back to potential output? Well, they can do the opposite of what they would do to close a recessionary gap. So in this case, they need to decrease demand. And if you decrease spending, it decreases demand. So if we decrease government spending, or if they increase your taxes to decrease your spending, either will work, or a combination of the two will work as well. That will help close that expansionary gap and keep the economy from overheating. We call that contractionary fiscal policy. We're trying to contract the economy and bring us back from that high level of GDP. So here's going to be the graph for that. We have ended up with an equilibrium above potential output here at 14.5. The economy can function at that level in the short run for some period of time, but in the long run, a year, 2 years, whatever, that's going to need to adjust. So in this case, while the supply curve is going to shift to the left very slowly as the economy tries to heal itself, the government can get involved and close that gap a whole lot quicker than the economy can heal itself. So in this case, if we have a decrease in demand because of that decrease in spending, that's going to shift the demand curve to the left, decreasing demand, bringing us back to potential output, and you can see the outcome here is going to be deflation, price levels dropping. Deflation really isn't a good thing. You would think prices are dropping, that's a good thing. Small levels of inflation are a whole lot better than deflation. Okay, so let's just talk quickly about the evolution of fiscal policy. Prior to the Great Depression, here in the United States, we practiced classical economic theory. Classical economic theory is basically a hands-off approach to the economy. And so the government really didn't get involved in issues of the economy. They balanced their budget every single year. They taxed people in the economy at an appropriate level and didn't spend more than that. And so it was a very different time. But then the Great Depression hit, and the government said, wait, maybe there was something we could have done earlier on when this depression was looming to stop from going into a full-on depression, keep it just maybe at a small recession. And so it was during the Great Depression that we changed our way of thinking here in the United States, our government, in terms of getting involved in economic issues. Great Depression and World War II Great Depression, we realized that classical economic theory wasn't working, and then World War II came along. World War II is really what pulled us out of the Depression. War is good for the economy. There's lots of production necessary in order to support a war, and so it was really one of the greatest contributing factors to getting us out of the Depression. The government increased government purchases, which increased demand, which shifted that demand curve and helped close that huge recessionary gap that we had during the Depression. So discretionary fiscal policy was used for the very first time. This sort of government making a one-time decision to either spend money or decrease spending, in this case it was increased spending, in order to stimulate the economy. We talked already about automatic stabilizers. Let's talk about a couple of those in detail. The two that we talked about were our progressive income tax system and transfer payments. So automatic stabilizers, we already talked about, help smooth out those sort of daily fluctuations, monthly, yearly fluctuations in disposable income. So during good times, we try and take more in taxes because people are making more money, and we pay less out in transfer payments. The opposite happens during a recession. We usually are paying more in transfer payments and getting less tax revenue. But either way, that helps to sort of level out, it doesn't level out disposable income, but it helps level out disposable income. So we have a progressive income tax. I already explained this to you on a previous slide, but basically, the more money you make, the higher percentage of your income you pay in taxes, and opposite for the low end of the income scale. Unemployment insurance and welfare, usually those payments increase during a recession and decrease during expansions or when we are functioning at potential output. And so that gives people, households, consumers, money to spend on goods and services, so that multiplication can still happen in the economy. Stabilizers reduce the magnitude of GDP fluctuations. So they just help to stabilize economic conditions due to stabilizing spending. Lags in fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, many would argue, is not a good tool for trying to heal the economy and help the economy, simply because of the layers of government and the bureaucracy that our politicians run into as they're trying to implement fiscal policy. It's not an easy thing to implement. And so there are lags in fiscal policy. Essentially, it takes a lot of time to get fiscal policy, discretionary fiscal policy approved, revised, and actually implemented in time to really have the impact that it needs to have. Many times we find that policies are enacted long after they were actually needed because it took years just simply to go through the layers of government and get approved. Discretionary fiscal policy leaves very little room for error. You're trying to get back to potential output. The government is trying to make decisions to get us back to potential output. That's a complicated calculation to try and get us back there. They don't want to overcorrect and create an expansionary gap, and they don't want to undercorrect and leave us in a recession any longer than they need to. So it's a really fine line between undercorrecting and overcorrecting. You're really shooting for a very specific target, and that's going to be potential output. Let's talk a little bit about the latest recession, because that's probably the last time we saw significant fiscal policy being implemented. So in early 2008, Bush issued tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, because he sensed, his administration sensed, that the economy was softening a little bit, that something was happening. We weren't in a recession yet, but things weren't quite right and they needed to be stabilized. And so Bush cut taxes in order to give American people more money to spend, increase the consumption component of aggregate expenditure. In late 2008, we had a full-blown financial crisis. It wasn't quite enough, because it didn't solve the problems that were happening in the housing market and in the financial markets. And so while it gave the economy a little bit of a boost, that recession had something totally, there was totally different reasons we saw that recession happen than just lack of demand in the economy. So Obama, we call this the Obama stimulus package. The Obama stimulus package, this ended up being about $850 billion by the time all the money was spent, but the original package was $787 billion. This was money that the government was going to spend in order to increase demand in the economy and close that recessionary gap. So that's a lot of money. It was all borrowed. We borrowed every penny of that money. It's money we didn't have. That's kind of a problem. It came in a lot of different forms: tax cuts, entitlements, grants, loans. There was school loans, there was bailouts, there was all kinds of stuff included in that package. I'm actually going to give you a link to a video in which Obama kind of announces his package and gives you a brief summary of it. So I'll attach that. Make sure that you watch it. You will have an exam question that asks you about the Obama stimulus package. It was all deficit spending. I told you that already. Here's the really interesting thing about the Obama stimulus package is here in the United States, we have a marginal propensity to consume usually of about 0.98 or 98%, which means we save 2% of our income and we spend 98%. According to economists, your marginal propensity to consume during that time, the American household's marginal propensity to consume with the money that they got through the Obama stimulus package, some got tax cuts, again, some got loans, things like that. Your marginal propensity to consume went from 0.98 before the recession to, with this money, to about a 0.3. That's huge in terms of the impact that this was going to have on the economy, or lack of impact, as the case may be. And so if we think about the multiplier was barely over a 1. I want to say it's like a 1.4 if you do the math. So a multiplier of 1.4, that means you're getting back the $850 billion plus a 0.4, 40% return or multiplication on that money. Well, a lot of economists would argue that we're paying so much in interest on all of this debt that we actually didn't end up better off because of the Obama stimulus package. That has nothing to do with Obama. It doesn't matter who would have been president during that time, they would have been forced to do something. And so this isn't about Obama as much as it's about what the economy was like at that time and what people receiving this money thought that they should do with that money because of the unpredictability in the job markets and things like that. So that's it for this chapter on fiscal policy. I will see you next week. Make sure you read and you're ready to talk about monetary policy next Wednesday.